Hi everyone, my name is Madison Sweeney. I am a student at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and you are watching this presentation today because you are a high school student in a psychology class and probably nearing graduation. And so I kind of came up with a presentation here about this course. It's called The Biological Basis of Emotion, or Psychology 302, with Dr. Havis. I made this presentation as a way to kind of demonstrate to you that if you're potentially thinking about a psychology major, or even if you need some type of electives, I really want to use this presentation to potentially convince you why you should take this course. And going off of that, we'll kind of dive deep into what I learned from this course and what I think that you could potentially get out of it too. So thank you for watching, and we will go ahead and get started. All right, so let's get right into it. So why should you be interested in taking this course? To start off, emotions are a part of everybody's life. Everybody goes through them, everybody experiences them. So it's important to have a good understanding of them so that we can better deal with them as individuals. The definition for emotion, so basically they're a combination of our body and brain's reactions to things in the world. So by combination, I mean that emotions are our physiological responses, so like sweating and our heart rate and things like that. But they're also our conscious and unconscious feelings, thoughts, and intuitions. And that conscious and unconscious part is key because emotions are something that we can't control, right? So a lot of people can feel overwhelmed by their emotions at times. So this course is really cool because it teaches ways that basic biology and anatomy can explain that we can't stop our emotions from being triggered. So in other words, emotions are biological. And again, understanding that biology is important because when we understand emotions, we're better equipped to recognize them in others and in ourselves, and just really helps with self-actualization and relationships and things like that. Another benefit, emotions are scientific, so there's something that we can research and provide scientific explanations for. And because ignoring your emotions can be bad for your health. So like I said, a lot of people sometimes struggle with their emotions and ignore them or tend to like bottle them up. And this is not good for your physical or mental health. Emotional stress, just like any kind of stress, can take a toll on the body, and bottling them up can actually lead to mental illnesses and physical problems like heart disease, intestinal problems, headaches, things like that. And then this course kind of helps us to debunk some myths about emotion. So I have a couple listed there. The first one being that anxiety is not a normal response. You know, some people that suffer from anxiety, they think, well, that I'm weird, or that, you know, this isn't normal to feel this way. They instantly want to get rid of that anxious feeling. But the reality is that although anxiety is sometimes accompanied by unpleasant, like physiological side effects, some of it can be managed in a way that fosters growth. So we talk about like good stress, bad stress. I'm sure you've heard that. Good stress can push you to do better in, like when you're playing a basketball game, you know, and bad stress is that negative kind that takes a toll on your body. Anxiety is the same way because it's an emotional state. We can, if we understand it, we can reshape it and reframe it in a way that benefits us as individuals, which is really cool. And then I just wanted to touch on this idea of emotional intelligence. So if you see that picture that I have right next to the slide, it kind of shows some things that emotional intelligence can help you with. So let me back up. Emotional intelligence is the ability to identify and manage one's personal emotions and the emotions of others. So like I said, that diagram, there's been research that has proven that people with increased emotional intelligence also have increased conflict management skills and empathy and compassion and self-management, relationship management, self-awareness, social awareness, team management, which becomes really important because some other studies have shown that bosses in the workplace value emotional intelligence just as much, if not more, than they value intellectual intelligence because of things that it increases that you see listed here. So, having empathy and compassion for other people, it just having a high degree of emotional intelligence just makes you a better, more well-rounded person overall. So yeah, that's a couple of reasons that I think you should take this course. It was definitely some great things that I got out of it. All right, so what are emotions? We kind of touched on that definition in the slide previous. And like I said, it's hard to define them. They are complex. So there are a few theories of emotion that exist. These are all pretty older theories. The first one being basic emotional theory. And that theory persists that emotions, we have six basic emotions. You can see them there in that picture. So happiness, sadness, fear, disgust, anger, and surprise. This theory says that those are basic emotions, meaning they're innate, they're universal in everybody, they're automatic, they happen fast, and that they trigger behavior that has high survival value. So, like running away when there's a creature in front of you. High survival value being that emotion of fear triggers that response automatically for you to run away and protect yourself. The next theory, constructivist theory, believes that emotions are feeling states that can't be attributed to specific biological aspects of the brain. So, there's no blueprint for emotions. There's not just one area that produces your emotions inside of your brain. Constructivists see emotions as being primarily social and based on cognition, so thinking. And they also believe that consciousness is necessary to experience emotion. And then the third theory is objectivist theory of emotion. And that one believes that emotions are based on an individual's experience and reality. There's some part a result of a biological process, so what's going on inside your body and stuff. And then they also believe that in some part, they are due to cognition, what's going on in your brain. They believe that emotions all share similar properties, and we'll go over that in a second. And also, they have stated that more research just needs to be done on emotions to really be able to articulate a true definition. So, like I said, those are some basic theories, ideas of where our emotions stem from. They all have a number of true aspects of them. They all have a number of critiques against them for why they don't make sense. Um, and then, like I said, in the objectivist theory possess that all emotions share certain emotional properties. So basically, in order to qualify as an emotion, a feeling state needs to have all of the properties that you see listed there. So the first being scalability, which basically just means the ability to change in size or scale. Valence, which is the degree of pleasantness or unpleasantness. Generalization, so a tendency to respond in the same way to similar stimuli. Global coordination, so the degree to which an emotion affects parts of our body. Automaticity is the degree of involuntary or unconscious association with emotion. And then emotions are forms of social communication. So, like we use our body and face to signal to other humans or to communicate. So, given that definition on what truly defines an emotion, think about it. What do you think? Do you think that romantic love, so the love that you share with your partner, um, do you think that that should be considered an emotion? Does it have scalability? Yeah, it can vary in intensity. It could, whether that be high or low. Valence can have pleasantness, sometimes a little bit unpleasantness. I would agree with that. Persistence. So, can it outlast the eliciting stimulus? The eliciting stimulus being the meeting of your partner. I think so, in, best case scenario. global coordination? Can it orchestrate a web of effects in the body and engage you fully as a human being? I would say yes, but you can make your own decision on that. All right, so why study the biology of emotions? Because it's interesting. It's a biological approach to study emotions. And what that biological approach piece means is it's a biological study of emotions is this idea that all of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors have causes that are rooted inside of our bodies. So, in things like our brain, in our genetics, in our immune system, nervous system, all of those physiological symptoms. Um, there's a couple of topics that biopsychologists focus on that are super interesting, I think. For example, they analyze how trauma to the brain influences behavior. They can assess the difference in similarities in twins to determine which characteristics are tied to genetics and a basis for behavior. They can investigate how degenerative brain diseases impact how people act, so things like Parkinson's. Um, you can explore how genetic factors influence things such as aggression. And then lastly, you can study how genetics in the brain you can study how genetics and brain damage are linked to mental disorders. So, this approach of psychology frames psychological concepts by studying the physical basis for people's behavior. I'm sure that you've heard of the nature versus nurture debate in the psychology class that you are in right now. Basically, what that debate is it's asking, is nature more influential in people's behavior, so their environment, their experiences, or is it, I switched that up. Is nurture more important in people's behavior, so their environment, their experiences, things like that, or is it nature? Is it biologically rooted inside of a person in the ways that they act? Um, so this biological approach to emotion obviously takes more of the nature side of that debate. And like any approach to any science, it comes with a number of strengths and weaknesses. So I have some of them listed here. This biological approach to emotion, it uses rigorous empirical methods. What that means is it uses scientific methods and it uses tools that produce reliable and valid research. And again, I'm sure that you've learned in the class that you're in right now, reliable meaning that these research studies produce the same results over and over again. So they're reliable, right? And then valid, meaning that the tools that are used are ones that are clinically proven to measure what you're intending to measure. So these are results that we can absolutely depend on or look to answer some of these scientific questions. And then lastly, it is deterministic, which basically deterministic just means that it can explain the cause of abnormal behavior. And then like any approach to any type of science, it also comes with a few drawbacks or weaknesses. Like I said, it really focuses on that nature piece of the nature versus nurture debate. So it kind of ignores the influence of personal experience and of people's environments. And then it doesn't explain human consciousness. So far we've covered what this course is and why you should take it. We've also defined emotions in a few different ways and identified that the objectivist approach is the one that lends itself to the biological approach to emotion. Then we discussed what it means to take a biological approach to psychology and the study of emotions, as well as some of the strengths and weaknesses associated with that approach. In this slide, we'll talk about some ways in which emotions can be studied. So in order to study a particular emotion, our research subject needs to be manipulated in a way that causes them to feel that emotion. In other words, researchers need to elicit or bring about an emotion before they can study its impact biologically and behaviorally on a person. So how do they do that? I have some examples listed here. This course taught us that researchers use something called the International Affective Picture System, or IAPS, which according to Wikipedia is a database designed to provide a standardized set of pictures used to elicit and then study emotion. So basically, the IEPS is a set of images and scenes that are presented to a human subject. These pictures or scenes can be of something mundane, like a picture of a landscape, or something extremely rare or exciting, like a scene that shows mutilated bodies, or something of that nature. We'll discuss how researchers use these methods to measure biological changes in the body in the next section. Emotions can also be elicited through social media. A study was done using Facebook users to discover the impact of exposure to positive or negative news feeds on individuals' posts. Researchers purposely manipulated the news feeds of thousands of users. Some they filled with inherently positive messages and others inherently negative. They then observed that depending on which condition the user had been exposed to, whether it be negative or positive, if it led to more of a negative or positive individual status message. So this phenomenon is called emotional contagion, which means that emotional states can transfer to individuals without their awareness. The researchers found in this study that those who were exposed to a more negative newsfeed had more negative individual messages on their Facebook, and vice versa. If they were exposed to a positive newsfeed, it led to more positive status messages. It's important to note that the subjects in this study were not aware that they were being manipulated, which brings us to some ethical concerns about eliciting emotions in humans for research. First, informed consent is a concern. Informed consent, as you probably know, is the process where researchers explain the nature of an experiment to a participant. The purpose behind informed consent is to make a participant aware of the research methods, goals, and any possible consequences that they may face because of participation. In the case of the Facebook study, informed consent was not given because it could have altered the results. But is this ethical? Another concern is deceiving subjects, or intentionally misleading or withholding information about the nature of an experiment. Again, sometimes to study emotions, subjects cannot know the true nature of the experiment without that knowledge affecting the results of the study. So in order to protect human subjects in these cases, there are things called institutional review boards, or IRBs. They review research proposals to ensure that methods are ethical. These committees are involved with all human research as a way to protect participants. They have the ultimate say as to what methods are justifiable, and these ethical concerns are just another example of the complex nature of the study of emotions. So now that we've talked about ways in which we can elicit emotions, we can talk about how they are measured for emotional research. First off, we can study emotions in the brain. This field of study is called neuropsychology, and it can produce two types of research results, causal and correlational. Causal methods in neuropsychology study the effects of brain manipulation or damage by making observations in a patient's behavior and affect or mood. These methods include neuropsychology, where researchers investigate consequences of brain injury. This damage can be in the form of brain lesions that are a result of disease, trauma, or birth defect. Advances in technology also allow for research to create temporary reversible lesions by using electrical current or transcranial magnetic stimulation. Another way to study emotion is through the use of psychopharmacology, or prescription drugs, that help researchers understand how neurotransmitters within the brain operate and change or impact emotion. There are also correlational methods of neuropsychology. These studies use neuroimaging techniques to study the relationship between particular brain areas and the emotions associated with them. For this branch of research, magnetic resonance imaging, or MRIs, are used to reveal brain structures, and functional magnetic resonance imagings, or fMRIs, such as CAT scans, are used to reveal brain structures, functions, and brain activities. And then the last category of how we can measure emotions is physiological measures. So as we know, emotions have a biological, behavioral, and physiological aspect to them. The last measure of emotion in research involves the body's physiology. One article that we talked about in class talks about the use of wearable devices that measure a person's heart rate by getting their body temperature, measure a person's physiology by getting their body temperature, heart rate, and skin conductance, or levels of sweat. So while all these methods of measuring emotion are useful, using measures like these by themselves are not very good predictors of emotion. Each of them comes with their own set of challenges. And that is why a biological approach combines methods from each of the three categories to understand emotions and their impact on body, brain, and behavior. Now that we have talked about how they can be studied, let's dive a little deeper into why we have emotions in the first place. Okay, why do we have emotions? First off, emotions are evolutionary adaptations. Let's break that down a little bit. According to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, organisms that possess traits that enable them to better adapt to their environment compared with other members of their species will be more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass more of their genes onto the next generation. So an adaptive behavior is a behavior that enables a person to cope in their environment with greatest success and least conflict with others. By this perspective, emotions are rooted into our biology as human beings. They are driven by environmental changes and are functionally designed by the process of evolution by selection acting in nature in the past. They also guide our cognitive, physiological, and behavioral processes in ways that increase our capacity for us to respond to a problem. So for example, pretend that you're married and a good-looking individual approaches your partner while you two are out shopping. You immediately experience feelings of jealousy. From an evolutionary standpoint, this situation occurred in very early human life. This feeling of sexual jealousy is an adaptation that prepped early humans for either violence, reproductive competition, or withdrawal from their mate to go find a new one. Either way, jealousy was selected by evolution to aid you in making a decision that best aids your survival and increases your likelihood to produce offspring. And also, emotions support effective action. In addition to being evolutionary adaptations, emotions support effective actions and behaviors. These behaviors first appear as serviceable habits or like reflexes that allow us to think or act in ways that aid our survival. So think like you're walking down a path and you see a snake. Your instant reaction is most likely going to be fear. It's that fear response that triggers your body's flight or fight response and allows you to make the decision to run away from the snake and avoid the perceived threat and bodily harm. Or take for another example, say you open up a jug of milk to pour your cereal and you're hit with a pungent sour smell. Automatically, your feeling of disgust aids you in making the choice to throw the milk away and reject that potential health hazard. So the emotion disgust just aided in your survival. So now we'll take a look into our emotions in the body. So as I'm sure most of you know by now, our body's nervous system is made up of two parts. There's the central nervous system, which is our brain and spinal cord, and then there's the peripheral nervous system. We will begin by talking about the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. The PNS consists of all of the nerves and ganglia outside of the brain and spinal cord. The PNS has two components, the autonomic nervous system, which communicates with internal organs and glands, and the somatic nervous system, which controls our body's voluntary muscles. So let's focus on the autonomic nervous system and its role in emotion. This part of the peripheral nervous system can be divided further into the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. The sympathetic division causes arousal of our organs and glands, while the parasympathetic division causes the same organs and glands to calm themselves. These divisions work together to control our organs and glands and to keep our body in physiological balance or homeostasis. The sympathetic division activates under conditions of emergency, so think like the fight or flight response. It's involved in emergency, exercise, and excitement. The sympathetic division reduces activity of natural killer cells involved in repressing immune response. It causes blood flow to organs to reduce damage to the body during an instance of fight, and blood flow to the muscles to increase. Lastly, it causes our skin to cool and our heart rate and breathing to increase. So it is linked to facial flushing and sweating. The parasympathetic division conserves body energy and maintains body activities at basal levels. It is involved in digestion and defecation. The parasympathetic division causes heart rate and blood pressure to be low, skin to warm, and pupils to constrict. It also affects glands of the head and neck and is involved in generating tears or mucus. I'm sure that you all have experienced the roles that I just described of these different divisions of your autonomic nervous system. Maybe you can associate some of them with feelings of emotion. For example, when you experience nervousness, you may feel stomach discomfort or sweat. These responses are due to ANS activation or deactivation, And in fact, all of these functions of the autonomic nervous system that I just listed are activated at some point during an emotional response, depending on the stimulus that you're experiencing and what emotion it elicits. There's some debate on the order of emotional events that take place in the body, and the next slide will go over that more in depth. So this is an image from my notes from this actual class that explains some of the theories of emotion. So there's the overall question is what processes lead to our emotions and in which order do they occur? And as you can see, there's a couple of different theories. The first one being the James Lange theory of emotion says that you're presented with a stimulus and then your body experiences arousal. So like that ANS activation we were just talking about. Then you have a conscious interpretation of that arousal and then the emotion occurs. The layperson theory of emotion is the simplest one. It says that you're presented with a stimulus, you automatically triggers an emotion, and then arousal of your nervous system occurs. The Cannon-Bard theory persists that once presented with a stimulus, you feel an emotion and your body experience arousal at the exact same time. So the arousal is the emotion, essentially. And then the two-factor theory of emotion says that you're presented with a stimulus, you experience bodily arousal, you associate a cognitive label with those feelings of arousal. So say that you start sweating, so you say, oh, I'm nervous, and then that is the emotion. So like I said, like most psychological concepts, there's always a lot of theories as to why they occur, and I will leave it up to you to decide which one you think is the most accurate. As far as this class is concerned, the biological basis of emotion, I think the two-factor theory of emotion probably is the most relevant. So are there brain centers for emotions? There are several brain centers that are linked to emotional phenomena. This includes the physiological changes, bodily sensations, subjective experience, and behavioral responses that are associated with emotion. For this slide, I will give examples of these brain centers and explain how they are linked to emotional experiences. So on the last slide, we kind of talked about the peripheral and autonomic nervous systems and how they control our glands and muscles in response to emotions. Here we will focus on the central nervous system, which is the other main nervous system in our body. The central nervous system, or CNS, controls most functions of the mind and body. It consists of both our brain and our spinal cord. Our brain, as I'm sure you know, is our body's thought center. Our brains help us to interpret our external environments, and our brain is the origin of our body's movement. The brain itself can be divided further into 4 divisions. Each division performs a variety of tasks. So first we have, and these divisions are the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain and the spinal cord. So first we'll talk about the forebrain. The forebrain is home to sensory, motor, and associative areas. These areas gather sensory information, process that information for perception and memory, and produce responses based on that incoming information. The structures in the forebrain include the cerebrum, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the isocortex, and basal ganglia. All of these interior structures work interdependently to help us form, regulate, and process our emotions, meaning that they all work together. So we'll start with the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the principal part of our brain. It can be divided into 2 hemispheres, the right and the left, and each hemisphere contains 4 lobes. You can see the location of those lobes in the diagram to the right. So these lobes and their underlying structures helped us to collect sensory information, process thoughts and memories, and produce behavioral responses based on information from our external environment. The frontal lobe and its underlying areas control our voluntary muscle movements and has a role in our cognitive functions like thinking, planning, memory, and judgment. So all of these functions are obviously very important in processing and forming and regulating emotions. The parietal lobe and its areas help us to process information about taste, temperature, touch, and movement. The temporal lobe houses areas that help us to process emotions and language. And the occipital lobe houses areas that are responsible for visual processing. So as you can see, the cerebrum helps you form your subjective experience of a situation outside the world. The structures underneath the cerebrum also play a role in our emotions, namely the amygdala and the hippocampus. Both of these structures are embedded deep into the temporal lobe. The amygdala is best known for its role in the emotion fear, but it also impacts our anger, our levels of attachment, and our sexual behaviors. The hippocampus has a major role in learning and memory, both of which are related to emotional experience. Both of these forebrain structures are part of the limbic system, which overall has a large role in processing and regulating our emotions. The forebrain also houses the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus relies motor and sensory signals from the midbrain to the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus coordinates the autonomic nervous system activity that we discussed in slides previous, which are all parts of emotional reactions. And lastly, the forebrain contains the isocortex, which is involved in sensory perception and conscious thought, and basal ganglia, which is responsible for motor control and emotional recognition and expression. Next, we'll talk about the midbrain and the hidbrain. So together, these two divisions of the central nervous system form the brainstem. The brainstem is responsible for life-sustaining processes such as breathing, digestion, ventricle circulation, heart rate, and sleep. On its own, the midbrain houses our inferior colliculus and superior colliculus. The inferior colliculus is the brain's main auditory center, and the superior colliculus processes visual, auditory, and sensory information. All of these are vital in our subjective experiences and formation of emotions. The midbrain also houses our reticular activation system, which is involved in attention, which is strongly influenced by our emotions. The hindbrain houses the pons, cerebellum, and medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is an area above the spinal cord that processes breathing, digestion, and heart function. The pons is a bridge that connects the medulla oblongata to the cerebral cortex and transfers messages between the brain and spinal cord. The cerebellum controls our motor movement and plays a role in our coordination and balance. So all of these brain and body functions that are controlled by our midbrain and forebrain are involved with our subjective experiences of emotions and our body's response to those emotions, including physiological changes and emotional behaviors. So I know that was a lot of information, but the key takeaway here is that yes, there are absolutely brain centers for emotion, but they're not mutually exclusive, and they work in conjunction with one another to produce and regulate emotions in humans. Is there an emotional brain? So as we've now learned, emotions require two factors, bodily responses and appraisals of the world. These appraisals are cognitive interpretations of our environment, meaning that they require a brain. Most living animals have a brain, but they all vary in structure and functional ability. So the question here is there a type of brain that can be labeled as an emotional brain, or in other words, a specialized, deep, primal, and wise brain? Psychologists have worked to answer this question for decades, and this slide will provide you with an overview of a theory related to the presence of an emotional brain. So in this course, we watched a video and read articles to learn about a theory called the triune brain theory. This theory is often called the three-brain theory because it actually persists that we as humans have three separate brains. The triune brain theory says that evolution has paved the way for the creation of three independent and competing minds represented by three different layers or brains. These include the reptilian brain, the paleo-mammalian brain, and the neo-mammalian brain. According to this theory, these layers are distinct from one another, but also connected in ways that allow for them to influence each other and impact our emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. So we'll start with the first layer called the reptilian brain. This is made up of basal ganglia and is the innermost layer. It contains wiring that is rooted in ancient history and is the exact same for all animal species, including humans. Because it was the first to evolve, it is responsible for primitive actions and emotional responses that guarantee survival. So like the ability to recognize and avoid potential danger, or like that flight or fight response we've been talking about, nourishment of the body, and procreation. You may have seen commercial ads that target the reptilian brain by appealing to these basic human needs. These are ads that initially elicit intuitive reactions and occur without rational influence of the other brain layers. So these other brain layers have an impact on human behavior, but the point of these ads is to draw the consumer in by appealing to their biological needs or their reptilian brain, and then to use those instincts as a starting point for the emotional and conscious layers of the brain to guide them towards what is being marketed. So the second layer, the paleo-mammalian brain, according to the triune brain theory, is the second to evolve. It can be found in the brains of mammals such as cats, dogs, and humans. According to this theory, this is your emotional brain. So it's responsible for emotional responses such as fear, arousal, or anxiety. It's also said to elaborate on those emotional responses with the addition of social emotions. Social emotions are emotions that depend upon the thoughts, feelings, or actions of other people. Some examples are embarrassment, guilt, shame, jealousy, envy, empathy, and pride. From an anatomic standpoint, this brain would contain emotional structures such as the amygdala, hippocampus, and hypothalamus that are found in our brain's limbic system. So this theory says that this paleo-mammalian brain is essentially what we have learned as the limbic system. And then the third layer is the neo-mammalian brain, which is the third to evolve and provides a top-down control over our most basic responses. So according to this theory, the various structures located on the outermost section of the brain, such as the neocortex and other thalamic structures, are in control of higher order functions such as learning, memory, problem solving, decision making, and reasoning. The presence of the cortex allows for conscious thought and abstract cognitive processes. It also allows for connections in all three of the brains to be made between physiology and emotionality. So here's some examples of how, according to the triune brain theory, these brains would interact with another. Say that you're thinking about death and mortality, which would require activation in your neomammalian brain, the third layer or cortex. So these conscious thoughts about death cause your heart rate to beat faster, which is a function of your primal reptilian brain, and then you become anxious, which is a function of the paleo-mammalian brain or limbic system. So here's another example. You feel hungry, which is a feeling formed in by the limbic system in the paleo-mammalian brain, or the second layer. So because you're hungry, your stomach starts to hurt, which is a function of your reptilian brain signaling to your body that you need food. And because of this pain in your stomach, you become angry, or hangry, as some people call it, causing you to make harsher moral judgments about other people's behaviors. These judgments, like getting mad at your sibling for bothering you and you're hungry or hangry, are a function of your cortex, so your third layer, the neo-mammalian brain. So to kind of summarize this theory is persisting that sensory events lead to bodily changes, and that these changes are signaled to the brain and integrated with your perception of the world. This integration generates emotional experience and is a function of your limbic or paleo-mammalian brain. This perspective provides important evolutionary perspective on how the brain has evolved in mammals throughout time in order to handle emotions. However, it is unlikely that a distinct emotional brain exists. Why? Well, all layers of the brain interact with each other to form feelings and behaviors. Regions that are commonly associated with specific emotions, such as the amygdala and the emotion of fear, are merely part of a system of emotionality. They're not solely responsible for it. Additionally, not all limbic or emotional structures have an emotional function. So for example, the hypothalamus. And lastly, there's really not any scientific way to determine which brain structures are emotional or limbic and which aren't, because of the interconnected nature of the brain. So this is why the triune brain theory, although popular, has a lack of evidence to support it. Human emotions and thoughts are dependent on brain pathways that are established by personal experiences. So while our brains may have emotional components, they cannot be labeled in their entirety or in part as true emotional brains. So moving on, we'll ask the question, are there brain systems for emotions? And if you've been paying attention, you will quickly realize that the answer to this question is yes. So here, a system is referring to parts of a brain that work together for a specific function. We have systems in our body for things like memory and sight, but do we have brain systems for emotion? This slide will give you an example of a brain system for emotion, for some brain systems of emotion, and explain their impact on emotional experience and behavior. So we'll start with the midbrain reward system. The stimulation of this system elicits pleasure. So this is a group of brain structures that are activated whenever we experience something rewarding. A rewarding experience is anything that brings you joy or pleasure. For example, say you clean your house for your parents without being asked, and they respond to that behavior by buying you a new video game because they are so proud of you. You feel happy and excited because of activation in your midbrain reward system. Your emotional pleasure makes you more inclined to clean the house for your parents again in the future in order to earn another reward. So your midbrain reward system here worked with you to form a sort of reward-seeking behavior, cleaning the house. The midbrain reward system is a combination of deep brain structures that allows for the production and transportation of dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that generates desire, motivation, and learning. Dopamine plays a role in how we feel pleasure. The midbrain reward system and dopamine can be used to explain a number of reward-seeking behaviors in humans. For example, the use of addictive drugs. These drugs cause a high activation in the midbrain reward system by producing high amounts of pleasure or euphoria. In addition to this, some drug users experience context-dependent cravings, where the appearance of cues associated with drug use cause an anticipation of that euphoric feeling and then an influx of dopamine. So the anticipation of the reward here causes the influx that results in the seeking or the reward-seeking behavior. So what is the midbrain reward system? It consists of the mesolimbic pathway, which is a path in the brain that connects an area called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, to another area called the nucleus accumbens. The VTA is one of the brain's primary dopamine-producing areas. The nucleus accumbens is an area associated with motivation and reward. It mediates our processing of emotions and pleasures. Another example of an emotional system in the brain is the mesocortical pathway. This is a dopamine pathway similar to the mesolimbic pathway, but it begins in the VTA and connects to the cerebral cortex, or the outermost layer of our brain. Here, it forms extensive connections with the frontal lobe and is important for a wide range of functions such as motivation and emotion. There are also subcortical pathways by which sensory information from your external environment travels in order to elicit emotional reactions. One of them carries this information to the amygdala via the thalamus. This route is known as the low road, or quick and dirty pathway in the brain. It is named this because it elicits fast reactions without conscious thoughts, because the sensory stimulus goes directly from however you perceive it. So you see something scary, that information is carried via the low road or the quick and dirty pathway directly to the amygdala. So then another emotional brain system is the high road, which operates similar to the low road that we just talked about, but in this case, the stimulus goes to the sensory thalamus, to the sensory cortex, so that outermost layer of the brain, and then to the amygdala to elicit emotional responses. Because of its connection to the cerebral cortex, this pathway triggers conscious thoughts and actions. This longer pathway to the amygdala is slower and less direct, but it provides you with more details about a stimulus. So the answer to our question here, are there brain systems for emotions, is of course. We already learned about the autonomic nervous system, the central nervous system, and the limbic system, all of which are responsible or play a part in emotional formation, regulation, and reaction. Okay, so do individuals differ in emotion biology? So to begin answering this question, it's important to note some universal principles of emotion. First, emotions reflect universal dimensions of the world. This course taught us about the circumflex model of emotion, which identifies two underlying dimensions of all emotions, arousal and valence. You can see that model to the right of the presentation. Arousal means level of activation, and valence means degree of pleasantness or unpleasantness. The circumflex model, shown to the right, allows for us to distribute emotions or affect in a two-dimensional space based on their associated arousal and valence. Biologically, as we've learned, the amygdala responds to the intensity of a stimulus. Another brain area called the insula or insular cortex is what responds to the valence of a stimulus. As humans, we obviously all have these brain areas, and while emotions can be described using this model, that description differs depending on your individual evaluation of the world. This course will give you an opportunity to identify how you differ emotionally as an individual. You'll get a chance to determine your degree of positive and negative affect or mood using the Positive and Negative Affect Schedule, or PANAS. This is a clinical self-report tool used to measure if you are a person that views the world as like the glass half empty, which would be labeled as negative affect, or glass half full, which would be positive. You also get to fill out the regulatory focus questionnaire to determine your individual orientation towards your goals. Goal orientation and affect can affect all of our emotional experiences, but do they affect our biology? Does our biology reflect the differences in emotional interpretation? For example, can we ask the question whether or not individual emotional style and motivational direction impacts the structure or function of emotional brain systems such as the amygdala and insular cortex? This course will give you an opportunity to answer that question. So let's start by identifying a few individual differences in emotionality. To do so in this course, you will learn about perspectives of the world that dictate human behavior towards goals, namely promotion orientation and prevention orientation. Promotion-oriented people are more sensitive to gains in their environment. These people are concerned with achieving their goals and receiving praise for it. A promotion-oriented person might be more likely to take a risk, such as moving to a new city to pursue a job opportunity. Their emotional style pushes them to take great leaps of faith in order to achieve great goals and receive praise for them. A prevention-oriented person is more sensitive to losses in their environment. A person with this perspective may fear the move to a new city and choose to remain in their hometown in order to avoid failure and maintain their status quo. We learn that these perspectives actually do affect emotional biology of individuals. For example, a research study separated participants according to their orientation, promotion, or prevention. Then they asked participants to rank the valence and arousal levels of different words. They did this while monitoring activity in the participants' amygdala. This study found that the degree of prevention orientation correlated with how positively or negatively participants ranked the words. Specifically, it showed that the degree of prevention orientation correlated with amygdala activity for negative words, and the degree of promotion orientation correlated with amygdala activity for positive words. In other words, those with a promotion orientation correlated with increased amygdala activity for positive words, and those with the prevention orientation correlated with increased amygdala activity for negative words. It's important to note here that the amygdala activity does not reflect objective values of the world. That depends entirely on the individual and how they see the world. How one sees the world is dependent on individual traits and differences. Another study on emotional styles and their impact on brain function compared motivational direction with activity levels on both sides of the brain. Those people who experience approach emotions such as happy, surprised, or angry more often would be said to have an approach style of emotion. Those who experience more withdrawal emotions frequently, like sadness, disgust, or fear, would be said to have a withdrawal emotional style. So here, researchers measured left and right brain activities in participants using an EEG machine. While these participants filled out the PANAS scale that I mentioned before. The PANAS allowed them to identify their emotional style or motivational direction. The PANAS does so by providing you with an overall score ranging from 10 to 50 for both positive and negative affect. A higher score indicates that you have a more positive affect, and a lower score indicates a more negative. Results from the study showed that higher activity in the left side of the brain was correlated with higher scores for positive affect, so approach emotional styles. And higher activities on the right side of the brain correlated with higher scores for negative affect, so withdrawn emotional styles. So the asymmetry in the frontal lobe does reflect motivational direction or emotional style. And I think it's important to note that this asymmetry is due to brain lateralization, which is shown in the graphic on the bottom right of the screen. I'm sure that you've heard the idea that some people are right brain people, meaning that they're intuitive, thoughtful, and subjective. And some people are left brain people, meaning that they're more logical, analytical, and objective. This idea is a myth. This class will teach you that the left hemisphere of the brain receives input from the parasympathetic nervous system regarding nourishment, safety, and group-oriented emotions. It deals with our approach emotions and encourages us to approach things that will aid in our survival. The right hemisphere receives input from the sympathetic nervous system regarding arousal, danger, and individual-oriented emotions. It deals with our withdrawal emotions when faced with things that we want to avoid. The insular cortex, or the insula that I mentioned earlier, is the area that determines the valence of a stimulus and sends the information to the appropriate hemisphere of the brain. So in conclusion, individuals do differ in terms of emotional biology. However, our emotions themselves reflect our appraisals of the world, not some objective properties of it. We understand emotional biology better by studying these individual differences. The next few slides will answer the question as to whether or not emotional biology affects cognition. This first slide focuses on the biology of emotion and decision making. Many people believe that emotional states are separate from cognitive states. People think that emotions aren't based on reality, when really they correspond to our appraisals of the world, so they do. People think that emotions aren't helpful for survival, but they help us navigate the world effectively. And people also think that emotions don't aid in cognition, that they just hinder it, but really they shape cognition to be more effective. Research evidence suggests that emotions guide cognition in an adaptive fashion because they help us to juggle and prioritize multiple goals, deal with novelty so that we don't respond randomly or get lost in thought and fail to act, redirect our attention, and support decision making. You'll see on the slide here some information about how emotional biology impacts decision making. So first we'll focus on the frontal lobes and prefrontal cortex. The frontal lobe is associated with movement and planning. The frontal lobe is covered in prefrontal cortex. There's two parts of the frontal cortex. First one being the motor cortex, which sends signals to muscles for movement execution, and the premotor cortex, which is involved in selecting movements to be executed. The second part of the frontal cortex is the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in high-level cognitive functions. There are important areas of the prefrontal cortex that have distinct purposes in decision making. Those are the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and the orbital frontal prefrontal cortex. The orbital frontal cortex plays roles in decisions about primarily intrinsically rewarding rewards. An unconditioned stimulus causes a response in the amygdala, and the amygdala decides whether or not the stimulus has positive valence or negative valence, so goodness or inherent badness. The orbital frontal cortex modifies the amygdala to modify how we feel about an unconditioned stimulus. And in addition to this, the orbital frontal cortex can modify the activity of the amygdala to update the emotional significance of a stimulus. So you'll see on the bottom of the screen there I have the flow chart that kind of explains how this happens. So an unconditioned stimulus that is intrinsically rewarding, like a donut, triggers an amygdala response. So our amygdala associates that stimulus as having a positive valence. Our response in our nervous system is to get up and eat that donut because of our amygdala response. But sometimes have just, if we have one, or I'm sorry, we see the donuts, and if there's an entire case of them, our amygdala associates that as something positive. Our nervous system allows for us to get up and eat them. If we eat the entire case of donuts and we feel sickly full, our orbitofrontal cortex will modify the emotional significance of that donut. So instead of an unconditioned stimulus, the amygdala changes that to a conditioned stimulus and associates it as having a negative valence. So that's just one example of how the orbitofrontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, plays a role in our decision making. I know that sometimes it can be kind of hard to understand all of these biological terms and interpret some of the research findings that I'm presenting to you. So this slide just has an example of everyday decision making and its relation to the neurobiology of emotion. This is actually taken directly from one of the homework assignments that we did in this course. So if you want to just pause the presentation to get a better understanding of this concept of emotional biology and decision making. So in this slide, we'll continue answering the question, does emotional biology impact cognition? Specifically in this slide, we're going to look at how language causes emotion. So language comprehension interacts with emotional states. A study done by Dr. Havis and his associates, Dr. Havis is the professor of this course, identified that cognition and emotion share overlapping biological systems. So it says that certain concepts are inherently linked to specific emotions. This means certain concepts are inherently linked to specific biological systems. And there's a theory of emotional simulation that process when we are understanding language, we're running a simulation of neural systems that we would use if we were actually in that situation that we're thinking, reading, or hearing about. So this study, the researchers elicited emotional states in the participants by using the Strack method. The Strack method is a method where you place a pen between somebody's teeth so that they simulate a smile and therefore happy emotions. And then you place the pen in their lips to simulate a frown face, which would simulate negative or sad emotions. They then had participants read pleasant and unpleasant sentences one at a time while timing how quickly they read the sentences. They hypothesized that if emotional language calls on the same systems used in emotional experience, then we should expect a congruency effect due to the pen manipulation. So basically, if emotions and sentences are congruent, the sentences should be read faster. So they observed that when people had the pen in their teeth in the happy condition, the reading times for pleasant sentences were faster than the sad condition with the pen in the lips. Additionally, when the pen was in the lips, unpleasant sentences were read faster than in the teeth condition. So there was an interaction between the pen condition and the valence of the sentence. Remember, valence means inherent pleasantness or unpleasantness. So their findings from this study were that comprehending language about emotion interacts with actual states of emotion, and that language understanding involves a simulation of emotional states. So emotion states of the body interact with comprehension of emotional sentences. In another study, they wanted to investigate how language comprehension produces emotional states. So for this study, they used an EMG recording from facial feedback muscles for producing angry, sad, and happy facial expressions. The stimulus was the same sentences, so angry, happy, or sad sentences. The participants were tasked with reading emotional sentences and then pressing a button when they understood the sentence. They were told that the machine they were hooked up to was measuring skin conductance or sweat, but actually it was measuring the activity of the three muscle groups between sentence onset and when participants pressed the button indicating that they understood the sentence. In this study, researchers observed that the most amount of muscle activity was found when participants were reading the sad sentences, and the least amount of activity was found when participants were reading the happy sentences. And that muscle activity happened very quickly into reading the sentences. So from that, we can conclude that comprehension of emotional sentences rapidly evokes corresponding emotional states of the body. And then in the last study, researchers looked to see if language comprehension depends on emotional states. So again, Dr. Hovis and his associates, they did research on a group of participants that were about to receive Botox injections. Botox is a neurotoxin that causes temporary muscle denervation and blocks muscle feedback. So for this study, participants read the same sentences from the EMG study before and after Botox. So that EMG machine measured their amount of facial muscle activity. The researchers found that paralysis of the facial muscles slowed comprehension of angry and sad sentences, but not happy. So this meant that emotional feedback from the body has a functional role in emotional language comprehension. Again, this slide is just a more in-depth example taken directly from one of the homework assignments in this course relating to emotional biology and language. Again, I know that it can just be kind of hard to interpret a lot of those research results that I just threw at you, so I'm hoping that this can give you a better understanding if you go ahead and pause the presentation of emotional biology and language. So what is the biology of social emotions? In this slide, we will look at some findings about the biology of social bonding, contact comfort, human sadness, social rejection, and moral emotions. So for this course, we watched a TED Talk by Jack Panksepp about the panic system. Panksepp explains that panic arousal may be the main source of social pain. In his research on this phenomenon, he and his colleagues used contact comfort to decrease activation of the panic system in baby birds experiencing separation distress and thus crying, a response similar to that of an infant crying out for his or her own mother. To calm the crying baby bird and quiet the subcortical panic system that exists in the brains of humans and animals, researchers simulated mother bird wings with human hands in which the baby bird was held. The baby bird began to calm down and eventually fell asleep. This is because by swaddling the baby with their hands, they were alleviating that baby bird's social pain. This alleviation of pain was due to the release of brain chemicals called brain opioids that are activated through touch and counteract social pain. So by this definition, or this research, brain opioids are released to quiet the effects of pain, whether it be social pain, physical pain, and can be released through contact comfort. Since all mammals, including baby birds and humans, share similar neuroanatomy and neurochemistry, this research can be used to explain why swaddling a human infant has a calming effect. So because they are both mammals, humans experience the same release of brain opioids and the alleviation of social pain through contact comfort when they are swaddled in a blanket. For both mammals, this activation takes place in the emotional limbic system, with the highest levels of activation in the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. Lieberman explains this theory in his TED Talk about his research on the social brain and its superpowers. He says that social pain that stems from loss is our brain's evolutionary way to keep us close to important others, and it serves as an evolutionary superpower of our mammalian brains. The sadness response in infants in the separation distress in baby birds result in the crying out for their mother. The mother then shares in that social pain through activation of the limbic system and ACC, or that panic system that we were talking about earlier, and attempts to comfort her young via physical contact. The physical contact results in the release of brain opioids in the baby that relieves the social pain that it's experiencing. This pattern is repeated until the baby is old enough to care for itself. So, in this lecture, or in this week, this module, we also talked about moral emotions. So, what are moral emotions? They are feelings that motivate us to act on social knowledge about others people's needs, which is called altruism, or to act on social knowledge about our own morals, values, and social norms, which is called honesty and generosity. So they occur even in the absence of direct negative consequences for inaction, meaning that moral emotions can present themselves whether or not we'll face a direct consequence for acting on them or not acting on them. There are 4 categories, so they are divided into self emotions and emotions of others. And both of these categories are divided further into praiseworthy emotions and blameworthy emotions. So some example of self-praiseworthy emotions would be pride or satisfaction. Self-blameworthy emotions would be guilt or shame. Other blameworthy emotions would be anger, disgust, or contempt. And other praiseworthy emotions, also called elevation emotions, would be gratitude, awe, and admiration. These emotions are examples of paying it forward type emotions. So we have 3 main features of these elevation or praiseworthy other emotions. According to John Haidt, they are elicitors, which are elicited by acts of courage, kindness, loyalty, or any other act of moral beauty. Phenomenology or physiology, and those are caused by a sense of conscious, calm, relaxed, warm, open, pleasant feeling in the chest. Sometimes like getting choked up, those warm, fuzzy feelings that you get. And then the third feature of elevation emotions is the motivation. So something needs to inspire you to act in moral self-improvement. So there is some research on these elevation emotions, and if you look to the right of the screen, you'll see that there are some misleading information that exists in the popular media on the biology of social emotions. So one of them being that paying it forward is something that only selfless people do. Research has debunked that and found that that is not the case. And then another thing that the media has misled or exaggerated about is like the warm fuzzy. So that warm feeling that you get in your chest that you associate with like a heartwarming sensation. It really is just a result of oxytocin. So again, those brain opioids that are released during contact comfort. Oxytocin is produced in your thymus gland, and that gland wraps around your heart. And then back to the paying it forward example, the idea that that's something that only selfless people do is incorrect. Really, it's mediated by biology that we all share, and it stems from our survival experiences as infants. So moving on to the next bullet point, the evil emotions and their relationship to our brain's frontal lobes. So evil emotions, basically any emotion that has the absence or is the opposite of good. There's a couple of things that facilitate evil emotions, like human cruelty. Those can be like groupthink or a need to be obedient. So how do we make the opposite of these evil emotions? How do we make good moral decisions? The answer to that question is our frontal lobe. And we know this because of research on diseases that are caused by damage to the frontal lobe. So one of them being frontotemporal dementia. This is a rare form of dementia that's caused by degeneration of the frontal and temporal lobes. It leads to personality changes such as lack of empathetic concern or inappropriate social behavior. So damage to the anterior temporal lobe, including the hippocampus, results in a lack of cognitive and emotional empathy, so understanding someone and feeling for somebody. And damage to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex results in impaired decision making. And then another region affected by frontotemporal dementia are limbic structures such as the amygdala or the hypothalamus, and that leads to antisocial behavior. So how do all these things work together? The prefrontal cortex inhibits inappropriate urges, but connections are all bidirectional. So damage to any of these areas could result in damage to your social or good emotions. And then that last bullet point we talked about in this module is serotonin and moral judgment. Serotonin being a neurotransmitter in the brain. There's been research that has found that serotonin promotes effortful controls of violent impulses or reactions to provocation. So serotonin, by that definition, enhances your moral judgment and keeps you from making rash decisions based on those evil or immoral decisions. Serotonin also increases your emotional empathy. There's a research study that found that emotional empathy is linked to serotonin and found that it increases your willingness to engage in situations of personal sacrifice. So these are all things that we learned regarding to the biology of social emotions. All right, so this is going to be our last slide of the presentation. It focuses on the last module that we covered in this class that answered the question, what is the biology of emotional disorder? For this module, we looked at the impacts that stress can have on your brain and on your body. So we started by talking about allostatic load. Allostatic load is a measurement of how stress impacts individuals. A higher allostatic load creates higher damage to your health, both your brain and your body. Stress can be good. Stress hormones can enable fight or flight response and keep you safe. There's different types of stress. So chronic stress is constant stress. There's been research findings that chronic stress can shorten our lives. It can make us sick. Actually, up to 80% of all sickness is related to chronic stress, and it can cause you physical pain. There's also acute stress, which is a burst of stress followed by a return to homeostasis or your normal functioning. And there's a couple of ways to reduce allostatic load so that you can kind of avoid chronic stress and all of the negative effects that it can have on you. So you can eat right, you can make sure that you're getting enough sleep, and you can educate yourself on the ways that stress can affect your body. Stress can affect your body in a number of different ways. So the adrenal gland plays a role in stress. It releases stress hormones, including cortisol, epinephrine or adrenaline, and norepinephrine during your body's stress response. These hormones travel to your heart via your blood vessels and all over your body. So adrenaline can make your heart beat faster and can cause a rise in blood pressure. Over time, that can result in hypertension. The release of the stress hormone cortisol can cause the inner lining of blood vessels to not function properly. This can lead to a buildup of cholesterol plaque in arteries. Cortisol also increases your appetite and cravings for comfort food, which can lead to increased visceral fat, which is that deep, stubborn belly fat that so many people struggle to get rid of. Your brain also responds to stress. So stress causes brain activity, and stress causes the brain to activate the automatic nervous system. The brain communicates stress to your intestinal nervous system, called your enteric, and this can lead to conditions like irritable bowel syndrome by disrupting natural contraction in your gut, can cause heartburn, and it can actually just change the function of your gut bacteria and impact your digestion and overall health. Increased stress hormones can also make you more susceptible to infection and slow your body's healing rates. It also shortens your telomeres, which is the ends of your chromosomes, which can in turn shorten your life. So how can you protect yourself against the effects of chronic stress? You can change the way that you view situations. Try to think of stressful situations as things that you can control and grow from instead of thinking that, I'm stressed out, my life is over, thinking worst case scenario. Stress can also damage your hippocampus. So there's a complex relationship between stress and memory, which is controlled by your hippocampus. Short-term stress can impact your memory for facts. So you can have problems with acquisition, which is encountering new information, and consolidation, which is when this new information that you have acquired is consolidated into your memories. And this occurs in the hippocampus. So it's also influenced by the amygdala. And stress can also impact your ability to retrieve memories. So once memories are consolidated and encoded into your memory, they should be able to be retrieved by signals from your prefrontal cortex to whatever part of the brain that memory is stored in. So high levels of chronic stress can impact all of these steps of memory acquisition, which can obviously have a long-term effect on your memory and your learning and your overall functioning. Increased sustained stress hormones, so like that cortisol and epinephrine, norepinephrine that we were talking about, can damage your hippocampus entirely and decrease your ability to form new memories. So again, you need to prepare yourself to combat against the undesirable effects that stress has on your memory. Prepare for stressful situations in settings similar to the stressful environment that you're going to be in. So take practice tests at a desk and time yourself so that it's similar to the environment that you'll take the actual test. You also can participate in regular exercise. Increase in your heart rate and your breathing rates can cause chemical changes in your brain that reduce your anxiety and increase your overall sense of well-being. And also you can just participate in calming activities like deep breathing or meditation or mindfulness. And this can counteract your body's fight or flight response and therefore decrease your stress response. So that is the end of the presentation. I want to thank you for watching, and hopefully I was able to somewhat convince you why you should take this course, The Biological Basis of Emotion, in your college career, especially if you are interested in pursuing a major in psychology. I want to remind you that each of these slides and their related questions that were at the top of every slide, those stem directly from the course objectives that we got in the beginning of the semester in our syllabus. So this PowerPoint was meant to be an entire whole course overview of what I learned from this class, what you can expect to learn from this class, and why it is important to study the biological basis of emotion. Thank you so much for watching.